Hey everybody, Matt here. I want to talk today about the different stages of learning a piano piece. There are actually different stages to learning a piece of music, and if you're aware of these stages, it can help you a lot because the stage you're in can really dictate the type of practice you ought to be doing. And so this is kind of a complex topic, and it's not as cut and dry as I'm going to make it here. But just in a simple way, you can think of the three stages as being, or I have them as three stages. You can think of them as the kind of very first learning of the piece, the analytical learning of the piece, where you're trying to figure the notes and rhythms out and make sure you know how the piece sounds, kind of wrapping your head around the piece. And that's the very beginning stage. And then there's a second stage, which is the sort of repetition feedback loop, woodshedding, experimenting with different strategies and kind of ingraining things into your motor patterns, the learning of the piece. This is the part most people think of as the real practice of a piece, after the notes have been learned, after you've really kind of figured out how the piece goes. And then the third stage is the performance, the run-through stage that I've talked about before, getting yourself mentally prepared for performance, knowing what it feels like to keep going with a piece even when you mess up, and finding the areas of the piece that might need a little bit of more work in that kind of repetition stage. So just in the description of these stages, you can tell that you kind of go back and forth a little bit. So it's not like you do stage one where you figure the notes out and then it's all repetition, and then you get to stage three where it's just running through the piece and that's it. So you might be running through the piece in stage three, like I've talked about in other videos, and find out that there's some section that needs work, and you have to go back to the drawing board a little bit and do a little bit of repetition, a little bit of woodshedding with that particular stage. But the important thing to realize is that depending on where you are, that kind of dictates the type of practice you're doing. And if you're doing the wrong type of practice, if you're doing, say, stage two type of practice while you're in stage one, it's really going to hamper your ability to learn the piece effectively. So, for example, I see a lot in students, they ought to be in the more analytical stage where they're going slowly and really taking their time to figure the notes out, and not move too quickly so that their fingers don't get ahead of their thinking in their ear, which is more the stage one type of practice when you're first encountering a piece. But instead of doing this, they immediately jump to stage two. They try and play quickly and do the repetition without sort of having laid that groundwork so that they're comfortable playing the notes. So that sort of thing really holds people back. In fact, doing that sort of stage two practice in stage one is a lot of times what leads to tension, to a feeling of being out of control in the piece. And unfortunately, if it's too ingrained, it's very, very hard to fix, because all those tension issues, all that sort of playing without being aware of what's coming up, it's hard to kind of pull someone back and really fix those issues in a particular piece. But the same thing can happen if you're in stage two and you're doing stage three type of work. So if you ought to be taking small sections and doing repetition like you would when you're digesting a piece and really working something into your motor patterns, trying to figure out if you know exactly how something sounds, doing a lot of experimentation, getting feedback loops going like I've talked about in other videos, but instead you're just running through the entire piece and seeing what happens, you're never going to get that sort of refined type of practice, that refined type of playthrough that you want in stage three. You'll never actually get there because you've jumped the gun and you're already doing playthroughs. So I hope this makes some sense. I think that if you're practicing, a good thing to ask yourself is just, where am I with this piece? Have I just picked it up? Am I just learning how it sounds and learning what the notes are? In that case, you ought to be going incredibly slow, really taking your time to kind of lay the groundwork. Have I kind of figured out the notes and the fingerings and everything, and now it's time to do a lot of repetition? In that case, doing huge playthroughs, while it's okay, probably isn't a good thing to do as your only source of practice. You ought to be doing a lot of repetition of small areas, kind of figuring out where your problems are, getting feedback loops going. And then if you've really got that going, if you've done all that kind of stage two practice, it's very, very important that you do the run through of the piece, that you learn how to keep going even when you make a mistake, like I've talked about in other videos. So just ask yourself, where am I in the learning process? And let that help dictate the most effective type of practice for you. So I hope you find this video helpful. If you like these videos, I post them very frequently, and I'll put a link up here. You can go ahead and subscribe, and there's also a link below the video. And please leave comments and questions. I love to hear from everyone. And if you have anything you'd like for me to talk about in future videos, I'm glad to do that as well. I'll see you next time.